The bank stole his paid-off home, but he fought back and exposed the truth. What would you do if the home you worked your whole life to own, the home that was completely paid off, was suddenly taken from you? That's exactly what happened to James Carter, a hard-working man who thought his mother's house was safe. But one morning, he opened his mail and found an eviction notice stamped in bold red ink. The bank claimed he owed money on a loan he never took out. Within weeks, his home was no longer his. It was a mistake, right? A clerical error? Something a few phone calls could fix? Wrong. What James didn't know was that he wasn't alone. This wasn't just a mix-up, it was part of a systemic scheme designed to push innocent homeowners out before they could fight back. And when James started asking questions, the bank fought back harder. They froze his bank account. They repossessed his car. They even had him arrested on false charges. But instead of backing down, James did something no one expected. He became his own lawyer, uncovered the fraud, and took the bank to court. What he found along the way would shock the nation. A whistleblower stepped forward. A notary confessed to signing a forged document. And then, a leaked video exposed the bank's executives admitting their crimes on camera. This wasn't just about one house anymore. It was about justice. Would James win back his home, or would the bank use its power to crush him once and for all? Stay with us as we take you through his unbelievable true story, one that will make you question just how much control banks really have over ordinary people's lives. If you believe in standing up against corruption, hit like, comment, and share this story. And don't forget to subscribe for more real stories of justice and resilience. Because in a world where the system is rigged, the only way to fight back is to know the truth. James Carter stood in the kitchen of his late mother's house, staring at the eviction notice in his trembling hands. The paper felt heavier than it should, as if it carried the weight of every sacrifice his mother had made to secure their home. The bold red ink screamed at him, "Final notice, property to be vacated in 14 days. His breath hitched. This couldn't be right. His mother, Evelyn Carter, had worked for 35 years as a schoolteacher, saving every spare dime to pay off this house. He had watched her burn the final mortgage statement in the fireplace one evening, laughing as she declared herself free from the bank. But now, according to this notice, the bank was claiming she still owed money. His hands clenched into fists. This wasn't just a house. This was where he had grown up, where he had learned to ride a bike in the driveway, where his mother had read him bedtime stories on the old floral couch that still sat in the living room. And now, someone was trying to take it all away. James set the letter down and strode to the corner of the living room where his mother's heavy filing cabinet stood. It was an old thing, made of thick metal, the drawers sticking as he pulled them open. His mother had always kept her documents neatly filed, every bill, every receipt, every legal paper in its proper place. If there had been any debt, she would have told him. If there had been a second mortgage, she would have mentioned it. His fingers flipped through the labeled folders, property taxes, insurance, mortgage statements. Finally, he pulled out the most important document of all, the original deed to the house. The thick paper was slightly yellowed from age, but there it was, clear as day. Evelyn Carter, sole owner. Paid in full. No outstanding balance. No liens. Nothing. Relief surged through him for a moment, but it was quickly replaced by unease. If everything was in order, then why was he being evicted? He dug deeper into the file, pulling out past mortgage statements, final payment receipts. And then, he saw it. An envelope. Unopened. His heart pounded as he tore it open, pulling out a document that should not exist, a second mortgage agreement. The sight of it sent ice through his veins. His mother had never spoken about taking out another loan. She had been cautious with money, never trusting the banks after seeing too many people in the neighborhood lose their homes. He scanned the document quickly. The bank claimed his mother had taken out a loan 2 years ago. His stomach twisted. 2 years ago, his mother had been in the hospital after suffering a stroke. She had struggled to even sign her name on birthday cards after that, her hands unsteady, her writing shaky. His eyes darted to the bottom of the page. There, in slanted handwriting, was her signature. Or at least, what was supposed to be her signature. James felt his breath catch. It didn't match. The strokes were too uneven. The letters tilted at the wrong angle. It was as if someone had tried too hard to mimic her handwriting, but the rhythm was all wrong. James had seen his mother's signature 1,000 times, on school permission slips, on letters to family, on the very deed to this house. And this was not hers. His grip tightened around the document. Someone had forged his mother's name. He took a step back, his mind racing. Who? Why? The answer was obvious. The bank was trying to steal his home, just like they had done to so many others. He had heard stories from neighbors, stories about loans they never took out, fees they didn't recognize, legal documents they didn't remember signing. He had always assumed there was some mistake, some bureaucratic oversight. But now, standing here with a forged signature in his hands, he knew better. James reached for his phone, his pulse thudding in his ears. He dialed the bank's customer service number, pressing through the automated menu, barely listening as the robotic voice told him to please hold for the next available representative. He paced the kitchen as the hold music played, each passing second only fueling the anger burning in his chest. Finally, a voice answered. Foreclosure Department, First Union Bank. How can I assist you today? James took a steadying breath, gripping the phone tighter. There's been a mistake. My mother's house, she paid off her mortgage years ago. But I just received an eviction notice claiming there's an unpaid loan. The woman on the other end paused, and James could hear the faint clicking of a keyboard. Let me pull up the account. Yes. The property at 1628 Maple Drive. It looks like the account is in default due to non-payment on a second mortgage. James felt his jaw tighten. That's impossible. My mother never took out a second mortgage. Another pause. Then the woman's voice softened in the way customer service reps do when they think they know more than you do. Mr. Carter, sometimes family members aren't aware of financial decisions. Perhaps she needed extra funds and didn't tell you? His patience snapped. She had a stroke the year this was supposedly signed. She couldn't even hold the pen properly. I want copies of every document related to this loan. The woman sighed. You'll need to file a request with our legal department. But Mr. Carter, her voice turned firmer, it won't stop the foreclosure process. James hung up without another word. The next morning, he drove straight to the bank, his mother's neatly organized folder of documents clutched in his hands. The branch manager, Darren Klein, sat behind a massive oak desk, his expression unreadable as James laid out the papers in front of him. My mother's mortgage was paid in full, James said, voice calm but firm. This second mortgage? She didn't sign it. Look at the signature. Klein picked up the document, glancing at it briefly before setting it back down. He didn't even look closely at the signature. Instead, he leaned back, folding his hands like he had done this 100 times before. Signatures change over time, he said smoothly. People make financial decisions their families don't always know about. James pushed the document back toward him. She had a stroke. She couldn't have signed this. Klein barely blinked. Mr. Carter, if you want to challenge this, you'll need to hire a lawyer. He let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. But I'll be honest with you, lawyers don't take cases like this. James's chest tightened. Why not? Klein gave him a slow, knowing smile. Because these cases don't usually end well for people like you. James sat in silence for a long moment, his fingers curling around the edge of the desk. There it was. They had already decided that he wasn't going to win. But they had underestimated him. James stood, gathering his papers. If you think I'm walking away quietly, you don't know who you're dealing with. Klein just smirked. Good luck, Mr. Carter. James didn't need luck. He needed the truth. and he was going to find it, no matter what it took. James Carter stood frozen in the doorway, the eviction notice clutched in his hand. His pulse pounded in his ears, his breath coming in short, uneven bursts. He read the notice again, willing the words to change, to make sense, to be something, anything, other than what they were. Final notice, property to be vacated in 14 days. The paper trembled in his grip. His mother's house. The house she had worked her entire life to pay off. The house she had spent her final days in, at peace, knowing it was hers. And now, this? How could this be happening? His hands felt numb as he stumbled into the kitchen, dropping the letter onto the worn wooden table. The same table where his mother had clipped coupons and balanced her checkbook, careful with every dollar. She had never been reckless with money, never taken chances. She had paid off this house. He knew that as surely as he knew his own name. James rubbed his temples, his mind racing. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe some paperwork got mixed up, a clerical error, something that could be fixed with a simple phone call. His mother had been careful. She had filed everything away neatly, always preparing for the worst. He hurried into the living room, dropping to his knees in front of the heavy metal filing cabinet that stood against the wall. The drawers stuck like always, forcing him to yank them open. Inside, a world of perfectly labeled folders, bills, receipts, tax records, everything his mother had ever kept. His fingers found the tab labeled mortgage and deed, and he pulled it out, his heart hammering. He flipped through the stack of papers, the memories attached to them flashing through his mind, his mother sitting right here, showing him the final mortgage statement, her smile tired but triumphant. She had been so proud that day. He found it. The deed to the house. Her name in bold print, Evelyn Carter, sole owner. His eyes darted to the line that mattered most, paid in full. Relief flooded through him. He wasn't imagining things. She had paid it off. It was right here, in black and white. So why was the bank saying otherwise? His relief was quickly swallowed by a deeper panic. If this was a mistake, why had it gone this far? Why was there an eviction notice instead of a simple overdue payment warning? He needed answers. Now. James grabbed his phone, his fingers fumbling as he searched for the bank's number. He pressed the call button and held the phone to his ear, pacing the length of the kitchen. A robotic voice answered. "Welcome to First Union Bank. Please listen carefully to the following options." He gritted his teeth as the menu options dragged on. He jabbed at the phone, choosing what seemed closest to foreclosure assistance. After a series of press 1 for this, press 2 for that, the line finally clicked to a real person. Foreclosure Department, First Union Bank. How can I assist you today? James exhaled sharply. Yes, I just received an eviction notice for my mother's home, but the mortgage was paid off. There must be some mistake. The woman on the other end paused. He could hear the faint clicking of a keyboard. "Let me pull up the account," she said. A moment later, her voice returned, flat, rehearsed. "Sir, this property has been in default for non-payment of a second mortgage for over a year. The foreclosure has already been processed." James's breath caught. A second mortgage? His voice rose despite himself. "There is no second mortgage. My mother never took out another loan." Another pause. Another keyboard click. "Sir, our records show a second mortgage was taken out 2 years ago." James gripped the phone tighter. 2 years ago, my mother had a stroke. She could barely hold a pen. There's no way she signed anything. The woman sighed, the kind of sigh that said, "I don't care." "Mr. Carter, I understand this may be upsetting, but sometimes family members take out loans without informing others. Perhaps she needed extra funds?" James felt his pulse hammer against his skull. "No. That's not possible. Sir, if you'd like copies of the loan documents, you'll need to file a request with our legal department. But I must inform you, this will not stop the foreclosure process." His free hand curled into a fist. So, what? You're saying you can just take the house based on some mystery loan my mother never signed? A slight pause. Then, the scripted response. Sir, I can only provide information available in our system. If you believe there's an error, you may consult legal counsel. Legal counsel. As if he had thousands of dollars lying around for a lawyer. As if he had months to fight this. James closed his eyes, gripping the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. Fine, he said, his voice low and controlled. I want the documents. I want every single paper you have that says my mother signed that loan. The woman hesitated. File a request with legal, she said again. I can transfer you. The line clicked, and another robotic voice took over. James didn't wait. He hung up and slammed his phone onto the table. His heart thundered in his chest. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a clerical error. Something was wrong. He turned back to the filing cabinet, digging through every document, every piece of paper his mother had saved. Somewhere in this house was proof that she never took out another loan. And if the bank thought he was just going to roll over and accept this, they were dead wrong. They had no idea who they were dealing with. James Carter sat in his mother's kitchen, the weight of the past few days pressing down on him like a stone. He had spent hours digging through paperwork, searching for anything that could explain how the bank was claiming she had taken out a second mortgage. But he already knew the truth. She hadn't. The problem was, the bank didn't care. After his first frustrating phone call with the foreclosure department, he had filed an official request for the documents related to the supposed loan. He had followed the instructions, faxed the forms, and even sent a certified letter, just to be sure. Now, days had passed. No response. James drummed his fingers against the table, his mother's old coffee mug sitting in front of him, half full and forgotten. The silence of the house felt heavier now, knowing that if he didn't stop this, it would no longer be his to sit in. His phone vibrated against the table, making him jump. He grabbed it and saw the caller ID, First Union Bank. His stomach clenched. He pressed accept and lifted the phone to his ear. Mr. Carter? The voice was male this time, calm, measured. This is Elliot Brooks, a senior representative with First Union. I'm following up on your foreclosure case. James sat up straighter. Yes, thank you for calling. I sent a request for documents regarding the second mortgage. I still haven't received anything. A short pause. Yes. We did receive your request. James exhaled. Good. So when can I expect the paperwork? Another pause. This one longer. Unfortunately, some of those records are not readily available. James frowned. Not available? There are some delays in processing requests like these, Brooks said smoothly. We're working on it, but these things take time. James clenched his jaw. You had no trouble processing the foreclosure, but now you need more time to send me a few documents? I understand your frustration, Brooks replied, his voice polite but distant, the way people sound when they don't actually care. But these are internal records. We're not required to provide them on demand. James's grip tightened on the phone. So let me get this straight. You claim my mother took out a second mortgage, you foreclosed on her house based on that claim, but now you can't provide a single piece of paperwork proving it? Brooks sighed, a sound filled with manufactured patience. Mr. Carter, I assure you the foreclosure was processed according to standard banking procedures. Then show me the documents. Another pause. As I said, we're working on it. James could feel his pulse pounding in his ears. They were stalling. They didn't want him to see the paperwork because they knew, just like he did, that it wouldn't hold up under scrutiny. He forced himself to keep his voice steady. I'll wait for the documents. But I expect them soon. Brooks gave a small, almost amused chuckle. Of course. But Mr. Carter, I would advise you to start making arrangements for relocation. You don't want to wait until the last minute. James felt something deep inside him snap. He stood up so fast his chair scraped against the floor. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, voice low and firm. A beat of silence. Then Brooke sighed again. "That's up to the court, Mr. Carter. Have a good day." The line went dead. James slowly lowered the phone, staring at it as if it might suddenly offer him an answer. This wasn't just a mistake. They knew exactly what they were doing. They had expected him to roll over, to accept whatever they told him, to pack up his things and leave. They had no idea that his mother had raised him to fight for what was right. If they wouldn't give him the documents, he would find another way to get them. One thing was certain. He wasn't done fighting. James sat in his car outside the local law office, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He had just come from another fruitless meeting, another closed door, another firm handshake from an attorney who wouldn't take his case. He had walked into the office with hope, carrying his mother's mortgage documents in a worn manila folder. He had laid everything out on the lawyer's desk: the paid-off deed, the forged second mortgage, the eviction notice. He had explained everything, his voice steady but desperate. And then he had watched as the lawyer leaned back in his chair, sighed, and shook his head. "I'm sorry, Mr. Carter," the attorney had said, pushing the documents back across the desk. "I understand your frustration, but these cases are difficult to win." Difficult. As if that was a reason not to try. James had pressed him, refusing to accept the answer at face value. "This is fraud. The bank can't even provide the original paperwork for this so-called second mortgage. How is that legal?" The attorney had folded his hands, his voice taking on that carefully measured tone that told James he had already made up his mind. Banks make mistakes, but proving intentional fraud? That's a long, uphill battle. Without a signed affidavit from someone inside the bank or solid, indisputable evidence, judges tend to side with the lenders. James had felt anger rise in his chest, but he had kept his voice even. "You mean to tell me banks can steal homes and no one can stop them?" The lawyer hadn't met his gaze. "I'm telling you that courts don't like these cases. They take time, money, resources." James had leaned forward, lowering his voice. "So, if I had more money, you'd take the case?" The lawyer hadn't answered. And that was all James needed to know. Now, sitting in his car, staring out the windshield at the gray sky, he felt the weight of it all pressing down on him. If he couldn't find a lawyer, how was he supposed to fight this? He checked his watch. 3:45 p.m. There was still time. He had 2 more numbers written down in his pocket, 2 more firms that might help. He put the car in drive and headed across town, his mother's folder resting on the passenger seat beside him. The next office was worse. A woman at the front desk barely glanced at his documents before shaking her head. "I'm sorry, sir, but we're not taking foreclosure cases at this time." James frowned. "Why not?" She sighed, as if he had asked the most inconvenient question in the world. "It's a conflict of interest." James's jaw tightened. Conflict of interest? With who? The woman glanced toward the office behind her, then back at him. "We represent several financial institutions. We can't take cases against First Union Bank." James felt the air go cold around him. The banks owned the lawyers. The realization made his stomach turn. He wanted to argue, to demand to know how this was fair, but he knew it wouldn't change anything. Instead, he turned and walked out the door. By the time he arrived at the third office, the sun was already dipping below the skyline. The small brick building looked older, less polished than the others. A sign by the door read, "Community Legal Aid, Walk-ins Welcome." James stepped inside, hope flickering back to life. A young receptionist looked up from her desk and gave him a polite smile. "Can I help you?" James exhaled slowly. "I need legal assistance. I'm fighting an illegal foreclosure." The receptionist's smile faded, and she reached for a clipboard. "We're at full capacity right now," but if you fill this out, we can put you on our wait list." James felt his stomach drop. "Wait list?" She nodded, apologetic. "We have more cases than we have lawyers. Right now, the wait time is about 6 to 8 months. James let out a bitter laugh. 6 to 8 months. His eviction date was in 2 weeks. He shook his head. "I don't have that kind of time." The receptionist sighed. "I'm really sorry, sir. I wish we could help more people, but we just don't have enough resources." James should have expected this, but it still felt like a punch to the gut. He thanked her anyway and walked back out to his car, slamming the door shut behind him. He sat there for a long moment, staring at nothing, his heartbeat too loud in his ears. There were no lawyers coming to help him. No one was going to save him. If he wanted to fight this, he would have to do it alone. His fingers tightened around the steering wheel, and a new thought took hold. He couldn't afford an attorney, but he could learn the law himself. And if no one was willing to fight for him, he would fight for himself. James woke up early, the morning light filtering through the thin curtains of his mother's house. He had barely slept, his mind racing with everything that had happened over the past few days. His fight against the bank wasn't just about saving a house anymore, it was about survival. He reached for his phone, intending to check his bank balance. His last paycheck from the community center had come in a few days ago, and after paying the electric and water bills, he should have had enough left for gas and groceries. But when he opened his banking app, his stomach clenched. "Account frozen, please contact customer service." His hands tightened around the phone. He refreshed the screen. Nothing changed. Panic set in. His money was gone, or at least, out of his reach. James immediately dialed the bank's customer service number, his heart hammering as the automated voice guided him through a series of menu options. When he finally reached a representative, he forced himself to stay calm. "There's a problem with my account," he said. "It's showing as frozen. Can you tell me what's going on?" A brief pause. Then the woman on the other end responded, her voice cool and detached. "Yes, Mr. Carter, it looks like a fraud alert was placed on your account due to suspicious activity." James frowned. "Suspicious activity? I haven't done anything different." Another pause. He could hear her typing on a keyboard. "I'm sorry, but the system flagged multiple requests related to mortgage disputes and legal filings. It's possible that triggered a security hold." James felt a slow burn rising in his chest. He had only been requesting documents about his own home. That wasn't fraud. That was his right. "How long until this is resolved?" he asked, his voice tight. "These reviews typically take a few weeks," the woman said. "In the meantime, you won't be able to access your funds." James closed his eyes. A few weeks. He needed that money now. His grip on the phone tightened. "I need access to my money. Today." "I'm sorry, sir," she said, in a tone that wasn't sorry at all. "There's nothing I can do." The line went dead. James stared at the phone, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached. First, they had tried to steal his house. Now, they were trying to cut him off financially. He grabbed his keys and stormed outside, his breath visible in the cold morning air. He needed to clear his head, figure out his next move. But when he reached the curb, he stopped short. His car was gone. For a moment, he thought maybe he had parked it somewhere else. But no, this was where he had left it. His stomach dropped. A neighbor across the street, an older man named Mr. Douglas, called out. "Tow truck came by about an hour ago," he said, shaking his head. "Didn't look like the city, though. Looked private." James swallowed hard. He already knew the answer, but he still pulled out his phone and called the lender for his auto loan. A woman answered after a few rings. "Yes, Mr. Carter, your vehicle was repossessed due to non-payment." Non-payment? He had made every payment on time, even after losing his mother. "There must be a mistake," he said, trying to stay calm. I've been making my payments. The woman didn't hesitate. Your last 3 payments were reversed due to the fraud alert on your bank account. That put you in default. The vehicle was repossessed this morning. James couldn't breathe. His account had been frozen. He hadn't even been given a chance to fix it, and now his car was gone, too. He felt his chest tighten as reality set in. No car. No access to money. And to make things worse, he still had to go to work. James checked the time. He was already late. His shift at the community center started 20 minutes ago, and without a car, he had no way to get there. His boss, Tom Brooks, was patient, but this was the 3rd time James had an issue getting to work since the foreclosure battle started. He dialed Tom's number, swallowing the bitter taste in his mouth as the call connected. "Tom, it's James," he said, his voice rough. I just found out my car was repossessed. I can try to get a ride, but I'm going to be late." A long sigh came through the phone. "James, look, I hate to do this, but we're getting complaints. You've been distracted, missing work. The board is starting to ask questions." James's stomach turned. He had given everything to that place. He loved that job. "I'll be there," he said quickly. "I'll figure it out." Tom hesitated, then sighed again. "We'll talk when you get here." James knew what that meant. He stared at the phone in his hand, the weight of everything crushing down on him. No money. No car. A job hanging by a thread. The bank was playing dirty. But James wasn't going down without a fight. James sat at the kitchen table, the dim glow of his laptop screen illuminating the stacks of papers scattered across the worn wooden surface. Outside, the streetlights cast long shadows across the yard, and the quiet hum of crickets filled the air. It was long past midnight, but he couldn't sleep. Not now. Not when everything was on the line. He had spent the past few days being pushed around, dismissed, and lied to. First, the bank had refused to provide the documents proving his mother had supposedly taken out a second mortgage. Then, his bank account was frozen, his car was repossessed, and his job was on shaky ground. It was clear now. This wasn't just about his house. They were trying to break him. But they had underestimated him. James wasn't a lawyer. He wasn't a banker. He wasn't a man with powerful connections or a trust fund to fall back on. But he was his mother's son. And Evelyn Carter had taught him that when the world tried to take something from you, you fought back with everything you had. So, that's what he was going to do. He rubbed his tired eyes and turned back to his laptop screen. The search bar in front of him read, "Foreclosure fraud cases in the United States." The first few results were broad articles, stories of homeowners who had lost their homes due to paperwork errors, wrongful foreclosures, and banks using loopholes to seize property. James clicked on one, skimming through the words. A woman in Texas had her home foreclosed on despite having paid off her mortgage. A man in Florida fought a foreclosure after the bank claimed he had missed payments, but when he requested records, they couldn't produce proof. It was a pattern. Banks weren't just accidentally making mistakes. They were counting on homeowners not knowing their rights. James's mind raced as he clicked through more articles, diving deeper into the legal side of foreclosure fraud. He wasn't just looking for stories anymore, he was looking for answers. He started searching specific terms. Unlawful foreclosure practices. How to fight wrongful foreclosure. Bank fraud cases involving mortgage loans. Each search led him further down a dark and familiar rabbit hole. Banks had a history of targeting elderly homeowners, minorities, and people with fixed incomes, assuming they wouldn't have the resources to fight back. Some lenders fabricated missing payments to push homeowners into foreclosure. Others forged signatures on second mortgages, just like what had happened to his mother. And then, James found something that made his breath catch. Martin versus Horizon Bank. A case from 3 years ago. A homeowner had successfully challenged a foreclosure after proving that the mortgage transfer was invalid. James leaned forward, heart pounding as he read. The key to the case? The bank had failed to produce a valid endorsement from the previous lender when the mortgage changed hands. That one detail had made the foreclosure illegal. James's hands shook as he grabbed the folder of his mother's documents. He flipped through the pages quickly, scanning the paperwork related to her mortgage. And then, there it was. The mortgage had been transferred 3 times, from her original lender, to another financial group, and finally to First Union Bank. But something was missing. The final transfer had no signature. No endorsement. James's chest tightened. Legally, that meant First Union Bank had no right to foreclose. His mother's house was never legally theirs to take. He exhaled sharply, his pulse pounding. He had found their mistake. And it wasn't just a small oversight, it was proof that the bank had rushed through the foreclosure process, hoping no one would notice. James leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. He should have felt relief, but instead, anger burned in his gut. How many other people had lost their homes this way? How many families had been forced out because they didn't have the time, the knowledge, or the resources to fight back? James clenched his fists. His mother had worked too hard to secure their home. She had played by the rules. And they had stolen from her anyway. He turned back to his laptop and pulled up the court's website. If he was going to fight this, he needed to know exactly what steps to take. The legal jargon was thick, and at times, his head ached from trying to understand it all. But he kept reading, kept learning, kept searching for the next step. If he couldn't afford a lawyer, then he would have to become his own expert. He took notes, writing down everything that might help. Mortgage transfers must be accompanied by a valid endorsement. Homeowners have the right to request original loan documents. If a foreclosure is based on fraudulent documentation, it can be reversed. It was past 3 a.m. when he finally closed his laptop. His body ached with exhaustion, but his mind was sharper than it had been in days. He had something real now. Not just a suspicion. Not just anger. He had evidence. And when he went to court, they were going to have to face him and answer for what they had done. James turned off the kitchen light and stood in the darkness of the house that had once been filled with his mother's laughter. He ran his fingers over the edge of the kitchen counter, remembering how she had leaned there while brewing her morning coffee, humming along to an old gospel song. They had taken enough from him. They weren't taking this house. And if the bank thought he was just another helpless homeowner, too powerless to fight back, they were about to find out just how wrong they were. James sat at the kitchen table, the glow of his laptop casting long shadows across the room. The house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old wooden floor. It was past 2 a.m., but sleep wasn't an option. Not when the answer he needed, the one thing that could stop the bank from taking his home, was buried somewhere in the piles of documents spread out in front of him. His fingers traced the edges of the well-worn papers, mortgage agreements, tax statements, letters from the bank. He had spent hours researching foreclosure laws, and what he had uncovered was more than just a mistake. It was fraud. The bank had claimed that his mother had taken out a second mortgage, but they had failed to provide proof. When James started digging, he discovered something even bigger, a missing endorsement in the mortgage transfer. He took a deep breath and looked at the documents again. His mother's original mortgage had been with a small, local bank, the one she had trusted for years. Then, over time, that mortgage had changed hands. First, it was transferred to a regional lender, then to another financial institution, and finally, it ended up with First Union Bank, the very company now trying to take the house. James had read enough foreclosure cases over the past week to know that every time a mortgage was transferred, there had to be a proper endorsement, a signature from the previous lender authorizing the transfer. Without it, the new bank had no legal right to collect payments or foreclose on the property. His eyes scanned the page again, searching for what he now knew had to be there. The first transfer? Signed. Legitimate. The second? Also signed. And then, His heart pounded as he ran his finger across the final transfer document, the one that supposedly gave First Union Bank the legal right to foreclose. But something was missing. No signature. No authorization. Nothing. James sat back in his chair, his pulse racing. This was it. Legally, First Union Bank didn't own the mortgage. They had no standing. And if they had no standing, they had no right to foreclose. His mind raced through the possibilities. If the bank couldn't produce a properly endorsed document, the court couldn't enforce the foreclosure. And if the foreclosure wasn't legal, then everything, the eviction, the threats, the frozen bank account, even the harassment, had all been built on a lie. James let out a slow, unsteady breath. They had been so sure that he wouldn't find this. They had assumed he was just another homeowner who wouldn't ask questions, who wouldn't know what to look for. They had underestimated him. He reached for his phone and pulled up the number for the courthouse. He had spent the last week learning the steps he needed to take, and he knew exactly what had to happen next. He had to file a motion to stop the foreclosure, demanding that the bank prove they had the legal right to claim the house. He grabbed a pen and scribbled a note to himself. Motion to dismiss foreclosure due to lack of standing. The word stared back at him, and for the first time in weeks, James felt something close to hope. But as quickly as it came, reality set in. The bank wouldn't take this lying down. If they had gone this far, falsifying documents, freezing his account, even repossessing his car, they weren't going to let him walk into court and expose them. They would fight. They would bury him in legal paperwork. They might even create a fake endorsement to cover their tracks. James ran a hand over his face, exhaustion pulling at him. He knew what was coming. The bank was going to retaliate. But this time, he wasn't defenseless. This time, he had proof. And he wasn't backing down. James sat in the dimly lit corner of a 24-hour diner, a chipped coffee mug growing cold in front of him. His laptop sat open, the glow from the screen highlighting the exhaustion in his eyes. He had spent the last few days buried in legal documents, researching every angle of foreclosure fraud, but he needed more than research. He needed proof. If he walked into court with only his word against the banks, he would lose. Judges sided with banks all the time. Even if he pointed out the missing endorsement in the mortgage transfer, the bank would find a way to dismiss it, call it an oversight, a simple mistake. James needed something undeniable. He rubbed his temples, trying to think. There had to be someone on the inside, someone who knew how these fraudulent foreclosures worked. Someone who had seen it firsthand. And then he remembered the forum. A few days earlier, during one of his late-night research sessions, James had stumbled upon an online discussion board for whistleblowers in the banking industry. Former loan officers, underwriters, and bank employees had shared anonymous stories about how big banks pushed illegal foreclosures through the system. One post had caught his eye. A user named RM_truthteller had commented under a thread about foreclosure fraud. If people knew how banks process foreclosures, they'd riot in the streets. It's not about unpaid mortgages. It's about money, quotas, and getting away with whatever they can. I saw it happen every day before I quit. James had replied to the comment, asking if the person had any proof. No answer. But now, sitting in the diner, James had an idea. He pulled up his laptop and typed a direct message to RM_truthteller. I need your help. My mother's house was wrongfully foreclosed on, and I think the bank falsified documents. You said you worked in the industry. Do you have proof? Something I can use? He hit send and waited. Minutes passed. Then an hour. Nothing. Just as he was about to close the laptop, a notification popped up. New message from RM_truthteller. James's heart pounded as he clicked it open. I don't know who you are, but if you're serious, meet me in person. No email. No phone calls. If I send you anything, they'll trace it. I used to work for First Union Bank. I know exactly how they do this. If you really want to take them down, be ready to listen. James stared at the screen. First Union Bank. The same bank that had stolen his home. His hands trembled as he typed back. Where and when? The response came almost immediately. Tomorrow. 6 p.m. Corner booth at Sullivan's Bar and Grill. Come alone. James exhaled slowly. Whoever this was, they weren't playing games. And neither was he. The next evening, James walked into Sullivan's, a quiet hole-in-the-wall bar on the edge of town. It smelled of fried food and stale beer, and the dim lighting made it easy to blend in. He spotted a woman sitting alone in a corner booth. Dark hair pulled back in a tight bun. Eyes sharp and watchful. She had a drink in front of her but hadn't touched it. James approached cautiously. RM_truth teller? The woman's eyes flicked up, scanning him quickly before nodding. Rebecca Martinez, she said quietly. Sit down. James slid into the booth, his pulse steady but his mind racing. If this woman really had worked for the bank, she might be his only chance at proving what they had done. Rebecca leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. Before we start, let's get one thing straight. I don't trust you. I don't trust anyone. James nodded. Fair enough. She studied him for a moment, then let out a sigh. I worked in foreclosure processing for First Union Bank. For years. I handled paperwork, transfers, loan modifications. At first, I thought we were helping people, giving them a way to save their homes. Then I started seeing things that didn't make sense. James leaned forward. Like what? Rebecca reached into her bag and pulled out a small flash drive. She placed it on the table but didn't slide it over yet. The bank has a system, she continued. They don't just process foreclosures. They target people. Elderly homeowners. People with paid-off homes but not a lot of cash in the bank. If they think you won't fight back, they fast-track your foreclosure and push it through before you even know what's happening. James clenched his fists under the table. So my mother's case. Rebecca nodded. They knew she was vulnerable. They counted on no one noticing the missing paperwork. James felt a surge of anger. Can you prove it? Rebecca tapped the flash drive. This has internal emails between loan officers, branch managers, and the bank's legal team. I saved them before I quit. Her voice dropped even lower. There's one in there from Darren Klein, the branch manager you probably talked to. He literally says, if we delay processing just enough, by the time they realize the documents are missing, it won't matter. The courts will side with us. James felt his breath leave his body. They knew. They knew the documents were missing, and they foreclosed anyway. Rebecca finally slid the flash drive across the table. This is your smoking gun. But if you use it, they'll come after you. James picked up the drive and stared at it. This wasn't just about his house anymore. This was bigger. Rebecca sighed and stood up. I don't want to be involved in what happens next. I already lost my job. If they find out I gave you this, they'll ruin me. James looked up at her. Why are you helping me? Her expression softened for just a second. Because I watched too many people lose their homes while the bank got rich. I couldn't live with it anymore. She turned to leave, but before she walked away, she glanced over her shoulder. They're going to fight like hell to keep this buried, she warned. Be ready. James gripped the flash drive, his knuckles white. He was more than ready. For the first time since this all started, he had real proof. And no matter what the bank tried to do next, he was going to make sure the truth came out. James Carter sat in his car outside a small, nondescript office building, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He had been here for almost 15 minutes, staring at the sign above the door. Coleman Notary Services. This was it. He had tracked down David Coleman, the notary whose signature was on the second mortgage document, the document the bank had used to justify the foreclosure. The document his mother never signed. James had stared at that signature for hours, comparing it to his mother's actual handwriting, knowing in his gut that it was fake. Now, he was about to find out if the man whose name was stamped on the paper knew the truth, too. With a deep breath, James grabbed the folder of documents from the passenger seat and stepped out of the car. He could feel his heart pounding as he walked up the short concrete steps and pulled open the glass door. A small bell jingled overhead. The waiting area was quiet, with a few chairs along the wall and a desk where a young receptionist sat typing on a computer. She looked up, offering a polite smile. "Can I help you?" James cleared his throat. "I'm here to see David Coleman." "Do you have an appointment?" James shook his head. "No, but it's important. It's about a document he notarized." The receptionist hesitated, then nodded. "One moment." She disappeared through a doorway behind her desk. James shifted his weight, trying to steady himself. He had no idea how this was going to go. If Coleman was in on it, if he had knowingly helped the bank forge the mortgage, he'd probably deny everything. But if he hadn't known, if he just stamped the document without looking too closely, maybe, just maybe, James could get him to tell the truth. A few moments later, the receptionist returned. "Mr. Coleman will see you now." James nodded and followed her down a short hallway to a small office. David Coleman was older than James expected, maybe in his mid-60s, with a neatly trimmed gray beard and glasses perched on the end of his nose. He was wearing a crisp button-up shirt, his sleeves rolled up, and looked every bit like a man who had spent decades reviewing documents and stamping signatures. "Come in," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "What can I do for you?" James stepped inside, shutting the door behind him. He sat down, setting his folder on the desk. "I need to ask you about a document you notarized a couple of years ago." Coleman raised an eyebrow. "Which one?" James opened the folder and pulled out the second mortgage agreement, the one with his mother's forged signature. He laid it flat on the desk and slid it toward the notary. Coleman adjusted his glasses and looked down at the paper. As soon as his eyes landed on the signature, something shifted in his expression. It was subtle, but James saw it. Recognition. And then, something else. Regret. Coleman leaned back slightly, taking a slow breath. James watched him carefully. "You recognize it, don't you?" The older man didn't answer right away. He stared at the document for a long moment, his fingers tapping against the desk. Then, finally, he exhaled and met James's gaze. "I notarized a lot of documents for First Union Bank," he said carefully. James leaned forward. "Did you witness my mother signing this?" Another pause. A flicker of unease crossed Coleman's face. James's stomach tightened. He had seen this reaction before, someone wrestling with the truth. Coleman sighed and took off his glasses. "No," he admitted quietly. "I didn't." James's heart pounded. He had suspected it, but hearing it confirmed, hearing it out loud, was something else entirely. "You didn't see her sign it?" James pressed. "Then how did your notary stamp end up on this?" Coleman rubbed a hand over his face. He looked exhausted. "Because that's how the bank handled things," he muttered. "Someone would bring me a stack of documents, tell me the signatures had already been collected, and I'd notarize them." James stared at him. "Without the person being there?" Coleman gave a slow nod. I know, he said quickly, raising a hand. "It's not how it's supposed to be done. Legally, I should have verified every signature in person. But at the time, I didn't think much of it. It was just paperwork. I trusted the bank." James felt a wave of anger rise in his chest. "It wasn't just paperwork," he said, his voice tightening. "That paperwork got my mother's house stolen." Coleman winced. "I didn't know that," he admitted. "I swear to you, I didn't. They told me it was standard procedure. I never imagined they were forging signatures." James clenched his fists, trying to stay calm. So what happens now? Will you admit this in court? Coleman's expression darkened. Court? Yes, James said. I'm fighting the foreclosure. This proves the document is fraudulent. If you testify that you never saw my mother sign it, the bank won't have a leg to stand on. Coleman hesitated. James could see the fear in his eyes. If I go on record, Coleman said slowly, I could lose my notary license. Maybe even face charges. James understood the risk, but he also knew what was at stake. My mother is gone, he said, his voice raw with emotion. She worked her whole life to pay off that house, and they took it from her. They're stealing homes from people like her every day. And they used your name to do it. Coleman swallowed hard. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, Coleman let out a long breath and nodded. I'll do it, he said. James's eyes widened slightly. You will? Coleman nodded again, slower this time. I made a mistake. I should have been more careful. If my testimony helps you get your house back, then I'll do it. Relief crashed over James like a tidal wave. Coleman reached for a notepad and started writing. I'll give you a signed affidavit stating I never witnessed the signature, he said. And if you need me to testify, I will. James felt his chest tighten with gratitude. Thank you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Coleman gave a small, weary nod. I just hope it makes a difference. James took the signed affidavit and carefully placed it in his folder. It will, he promised. I'll make sure of it. As he left the office, stepping back out into the cold evening air, James felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. For the first time in weeks, he wasn't alone in this fight. He had proof. He had a witness. And now, he had a chance. James stood outside the courthouse, gripping the folder containing everything he had, the notarized affidavit from David Coleman, the leaked emails from Rebecca Martinez, and the proof of the missing endorsement on the mortgage transfer. The crisp morning air carried a slight chill, but he barely felt it. This was the day he had been preparing for. Inside, the courtroom was smaller than he expected, lined with dark wooden benches and buzzing with quiet conversations. James took his seat at the defendant's table, feeling the weight of every document in his folder. Across the aisle, Bryce Lambert, the bank's lead attorney, sat with a team of well-dressed lawyers. Their suits were crisp, their briefcases full of motions James hadn't even seen yet. The bank had come ready for war. The judge entered, a heavy-set man with tired eyes and a firm grip on the gavel. Court is now in session, he announced. We're here to hear arguments regarding the foreclosure case against Mr. Carter. James sat up straighter. This was his chance. But before he could speak, Lambert stood. Your Honor, before we proceed, the bank has filed multiple motions that must be addressed. James's stomach tightened. Here it comes. Lambert adjusted his tie and continued, his voice calm and polished. First, we request an immediate dismissal of Mr. Carter's claims on the grounds that his accusations lack merit. The foreclosure process was conducted lawfully. James clenched his jaw. Lawfully? They forged documents, fast-tracked the process, and tried to bury the evidence. The judge glanced toward James. Mr. Carter, do you have a response? James stood quickly, gripping the edge of the table to steady himself. Your Honor, I have clear evidence that the foreclosure was based on fraudulent documents. The second mortgage my mother supposedly signed, he lifted the paper for emphasis, was notarized by someone who never witnessed the signature. I have a signed affidavit from the notary confirming this. The judge took the document and skimmed it, nodding slightly. But Lambert didn't even flinch. He simply picked up another motion. Your Honor, he said smoothly, the bank also moves to exclude this so-called affidavit, as Mr. Carter has not proven that this notary's testimony is relevant to the foreclosure proceedings. James's blood boiled. Not relevant, he shot back. The bank used a forged document to take my mother's house. That's not relevant? Lambert didn't look at him. He simply turned to the judge again. "We also request dismissal on procedural grounds. Mr. Carter is not a licensed attorney, and his filings do not meet the necessary legal standards to proceed in court." James's fists tightened. They were trying to bury him in technicalities. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "Your Honor," he said, "I may not be a lawyer, but I have followed every legal process available to me. The law says I have a right to challenge a fraudulent foreclosure, and that's exactly what I'm doing." The judge rubbed his temple, looking between the two of them. He exhaled slowly. "Mr. Lambert," he said finally, "while Mr. Carter is representing himself, he has presented compelling claims. Your motions to dismiss are denied for now. We'll move forward." James exhaled sharply. Lambert's jaw tensed, but he simply nodded, adjusting his tie again. This wasn't over. They were going to fight him every step of the way. And James had no choice but to fight even harder. James Carter had expected resistance. He had expected dirty legal tricks from the bank's high-powered attorneys. He had expected stalling tactics, delays, and endless motions to dismiss. But he hadn't expected this. The intimidation started small. One evening, as James walked out of the courthouse after filing another motion, he noticed a black SUV idling across the street. Its engine rumbled low and steady, the headlights still on even though it wasn't dark yet. At first, he thought nothing of it. But when he drove home, the same SUV followed him. It stayed a few car lengths back, not close enough to be obvious, but enough to make him uneasy. James pulled into a gas station, pretending to check his tires. The SUV didn't stop, it just kept driving past. But when he got back on the road, there it was again, parked a block away from his house. A chill ran down his spine. Someone was watching him. That night, he double-checked the locks on the doors and windows. He kept his phone next to his bed. He didn't sleep much. The next day, it escalated. James had just finished a shift at the community center, one of the few places that still gave him a sense of normalcy, when he came outside to find his car's tires slashed. 4 deep, ugly cuts. No note. No explanation. Just a message, clear as day, walk away. James's hands trembled as he called for a tow truck. Whoever was behind this wasn't just trying to scare him. They wanted him to stop fighting. But he wouldn't. A few days later, it got worse. James had spent the afternoon preparing for his next court hearing, going over documents in the library. He had just stepped outside when a police cruiser pulled up beside him. 2 officers got out. One of them, a tall man with mirrored sunglasses, pulled out a folded piece of paper. "James Carter?" His stomach twisted. "Yeah." The officer barely glanced at him before unfolding the paper in his hand. "We have a warrant for your arrest." James's breath caught in his throat. "What?" Before he could react, the second officer grabbed his arm, twisting it behind his back. "You're under arrest for trespassing and harassment," the officer said coldly. "Hands behind your back." James struggled. "What? This has to be a mistake." "Tell it to the judge." The cold steel of handcuffs snapped around his wrists. They shoved him into the back of the cruiser. His heart pounded in his chest as the car pulled away from the curb, sirens off, moving slow like this was just another routine arrest. His mind raced. What was happening? He had done nothing wrong. He hadn't trespassed anywhere. He hadn't harassed anyone. And then it hit him. The bank. This was their next move. They couldn't beat him in court, so they were trying to ruin him another way. James sat on the cold, metal bench inside the holding cell, his hands still shaking from anger. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The air smelled of old sweat and disinfectant. Hours passed. At one point, a guard walked by and muttered, "You must have pissed off someone real important." James didn't answer. Because he knew the truth. This wasn't about the law. It was about power. They wanted him to feel helpless. They wanted to send a message, you can't win. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction. Sometime after midnight, the cell door creaked open. A police officer, older, gray-haired, with a clipboard in hand, stood there. "Carter," he said, his voice almost too casual. "You made bail." James frowned. Who had bailed him out? He was led down a long hallway to retrieve his belongings. When he walked out into the night air, a black sedan was waiting at the curb. James's stomach tightened. The back door opened, and Bryce Lambert, the bank's high-priced attorney, sat inside. "Get in," Lambert said smoothly. James's jaw clenched. He didn't want to, but he also knew that standing outside a police station at 1 in the morning wasn't safe either. He slid into the back seat. The driver pulled away from the curb. Lambert turned to him with a smug smile. "You've made quite a mess for yourself, Mr. Carter," he said. James glared at him. "I didn't do anything wrong." Lambert chuckled, shaking his head. "The thing about powerful people, James, is that they don't like to be challenged. And right now, you're making life very difficult for my client." James said nothing. Lambert sighed, then leaned forward slightly. "I'm here to offer you a way out." James narrowed his eyes. "What kind of way out?" Lambert pulled a thick envelope from his briefcase and placed it on the seat between them. "Take the money," he said. "Drop the case. Walk away." James stared at the envelope. He didn't have to open it. He already knew what was inside. More money than he had probably ever seen in his life. Enough to clear his debts. Enough to start over. Enough to make all of this go away. Lambert leaned back, crossing his legs. "No one will blame you. People take settlements all the time. It's smart. The right move." James clenched his fists. The right move? Was it the right move when they forged his mother's signature? Was it the right move when they froze his bank account, slashed his tires, and had him arrested on fake charges? Was it the right move when they tried to steal his home? His mother's home? James picked up the envelope. Lambert smiled, looking satisfied. "Smart man." James opened it, pulled out the stack of crisp bills. Then, he let them fall to the floor of the car. Lambert's smile faded. James looked him dead in the eye. "I'm not for sale." The silence in the car was thick. Lambert exhaled slowly, adjusting his tie. "Suit yourself," he said. "But understand something, James." He leaned in, voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "This isn't over. And the next time we come for you, you won't see it coming." The car slowed to a stop. James opened the door and stepped out. He didn't look back. He didn't care what else they tried to do to him. Because as long as he was still standing, he was going to fight them until the very end. James sat on the edge of his bed in the dimly lit motel room, the flickering neon light outside casting restless shadows on the walls. His heart was still pounding from his encounter with Bryce Lambert. The envelope full of hush money had felt heavy in his hands, but not nearly as heavy as the weight of his decision. He had thrown it back in the lawyer's lap, refusing to be bought, and now the consequences were inevitable. The bank wasn't done with him yet. His phone buzzed on the nightstand. A message from an unknown number. "Check your email." James's fingers trembled slightly as he picked up the phone. He hesitated only for a moment before opening his inbox. A new email sat at the top, subject line, "They got sloppy." Watch this. There was no message, just a single attachment. A video file. James clicked on it, and the screen flickered to life. The footage was grainy, taken from what looked like a hidden camera inside a sleek, modern conference room. 3 men sat around a polished wooden table, dressed in expensive suits, their postures relaxed. One of them was Darren Klein, the branch manager who had smirked in James's face when he first questioned the forged second mortgage. The other two were men James didn't recognize, but their sharp confidence told him everything he needed to know. They were higher up the food chain. Executives. The ones pulling the strings. The timestamp in the corner showed the video had been recorded months ago. "I don't want any more delays," the first executive said, his voice cool and measured. "If we process these foreclosures too slowly, we give homeowners time to fight back. We can't have that." Klein leaned forward, nodding. "We've already cut down the processing time. The key is getting them out before they even realize what's happening. If they don't know what to look for, by the time they get a lawyer, it's already too late." The second executive chuckled. "And even if they do fight, how many of them can afford to drag it out? A couple of months tops, then they fold." Klein smirked. "Exactly. And in the rare case someone does push back, we make it a paperwork nightmare. Confuse them. Bury them in documents. Courts don't want to deal with drawn-out foreclosure battles, so they side with the bank." The first executive took a sip from a glass of water, his expression completely indifferent. "And what about errors? If we foreclose on a property by mistake?" The second executive waved a dismissive hand. "By the time anyone catches it, the house has already been sold. We move fast enough, it's not our problem anymore." Klein chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "We had one last month, house was fully paid off, but someone found a loophole and pushed it through. By the time the owner figured it out, it was too late." The first executive grinned. "That's the kind of efficiency I like to see." The screen went dark. James sat frozen, the silence pressing in around him. He felt his pulse hammering in his ears. His case wasn't an accident. It wasn't sloppy bookkeeping or a misfiled document. It was a business model. This was how the bank operated, not just with him, but with countless other families. They stole homes, counting on people to be too slow, too overwhelmed, or too poor to fight back. And when someone like James did fight back, they retaliated. They had harassed him, frozen his bank account, slashed his tires, and thrown him in jail on bogus charges. But now he had them on tape. This wasn't just an internal memo or a leaked email. This was a confession. Klein and the executives had been caught admitting to fast-tracking foreclosures, burying homeowners in legal red tape, and knowingly pushing through fraudulent cases. James swallowed hard. He needed to get this to the court. But he also knew he needed to be careful. If Lambert had been willing to send men to intimidate him, what would they do if they found out this video existed? His hand shook as he transferred the file to a secure cloud account. He made copies, sending one to Rebecca Martinez, the whistleblower who had leaked the bank's emails, and another to the Justice Collective, the civil rights group that had been helping him. He even sent one to a trusted local journalist, just in case. They weren't going to bury this. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. He would present the video in court. He would force them to answer for what they had done. And this time, they wouldn't be able to hide behind lawyers and legal jargon. This time, the truth would speak for itself. James sat at the defense table, his hands gripping the edge of the folder that had carried him through this fight. The courtroom was still, filled with an almost suffocating tension. This was the moment everything had been leading up to. He had fought tooth and nail to get here, endured harassment, threats, even jail. Now, it all came down to one simple question: could the bank provide the original mortgage documents? Judge Bennett adjusted her glasses and looked toward the plaintiff's table where Bryce Lambert sat, flanked by two other attorneys. His usual smug confidence was replaced with something much colder, more rigid. He knew what was coming. "Mr. Lambert," the judge said, her voice calm but firm. "The court has reviewed the evidence submitted by the defendant, including testimony regarding forged signatures, missing endorsements, and leaked communications from First Union Bank. Now, I have given your client ample time to present the original, legally valid mortgage transfer documents. Are you prepared to submit them to the court today?" A beat of silence passed. Lambert cleared his throat. Your Honor, as we've stated in previous motions, retrieving the original documents has proven more complicated than anticipated. However, we maintain that. Judge Bennett raised a hand, cutting him off. That's not what I asked, Mr. Lambert. I asked if you have the documents today. Lambert's fingers curled into a tight fist against the table. He exhaled slowly, his voice noticeably strained. At this time, we are unable to produce them, Your Honor. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Reporters in the back exchanged glances, their pens already scribbling notes. James's chest tightened, but he stayed silent, his focus on the judge. Judge Bennett folded her hands and leaned forward. Let me be absolutely clear, Mr. Lambert. Your client initiated foreclosure proceedings against Mr. Carter, claiming ownership of the mortgage. However, without the original mortgage transfer documentation, your client cannot legally prove that they had the right to foreclose on the property in the first place. Lambert opened his mouth, but the judge wasn't finished. This court takes foreclosure fraud very seriously. Homeownership is not a privilege that can be taken lightly, nor should financial institutions be allowed to operate in a manner that disregards the law simply because most homeowners do not have the resources to fight back. She turned to James. Mr. Carter, given the plaintiff's failure to provide the necessary legal documentation, I am granting your motion to dismiss the foreclosure with prejudice. Furthermore, I am ordering an official investigation into First Union Bank's foreclosure practices. James felt his breath leave him in a rush. He had won. The foreclosure was nullified. Across the courtroom, Lambert sat frozen, his face pale. For the first time, he looked like a man who had lost control. Judge Bennett banged her gavel once. This case is dismissed. James closed his eyes for a brief second, letting the weight of the moment settle over him. It was over. He had fought against the system and won. James Carter stepped out of the courthouse, the bright afternoon sun nearly blinding him as he adjusted to the outside world. The cool air filled his lungs as he exhaled, relief washing over him like a tide pulling back after a long storm. The case was over. The foreclosure was nullified. But even as the weight of his personal battle lifted, he knew this fight was bigger than him now. A cluster of reporters waited just beyond the courthouse steps, microphones in hand, cameras rolling. The moment Judge Bennett had dismissed the foreclosure case with prejudice, news had spread like wildfire. James had gone from just another homeowner fighting for his property to the man who exposed First Union Bank's fraudulent foreclosure practices. Mr. Carter, a reporter called, stepping forward. Can you tell us how you feel now that the case has been thrown out? James took a deep breath and met the camera's head on. This was never just about me, he said. The bank didn't just try to steal my home. They've been doing this to countless families, people who didn't have the time, money, or resources to fight back. Today, the judge didn't just rule in my favor, she opened the door for real accountability. And I'm not going to stop until every homeowner who was cheated out of their house gets justice. The reporters fired more questions, but James's attention shifted as he caught sight of Rebecca Martinez standing near the curb. The former First Union employee had risked everything to leak the internal emails that proved the bank's foreclosure fraud. He pushed through the crowd toward her, his voice quieter when he reached her. You heard? He asked. Rebecca nodded. I heard. She crossed her arms, scanning the reporters still hounding him. They're going to push for an investigation. The judge's ruling just made it inevitable. James glanced back at the courthouse. He had suspected as much, but hearing her say it made it real. What happens next? He asked. Rebecca hesitated, lowering her voice. The state attorney general's office is already looking into the case. With the evidence we provided, the leaked emails, the missing endorsements, and now the court ruling, they have enough to open a full-scale investigation into First Union Bank's foreclosure practices. James clenched his fists. This wasn't just about getting his house back anymore. It was about stopping them from doing this to anyone else. 2 days later, the headlines broke. State launches investigation into First Union Bank over foreclosure fraud. James read the article on his phone, his stomach tightening as he took in the details. The investigation would review thousands of foreclosure cases processed by First Union in the past decade, looking for patterns of fraud, document tampering, and illegal evictions. His case had been the tipping point, but the problem had been festering for years. That evening, James met with Terrence Boyd and the team at the Justice Collective. The small but relentless civil rights group had been instrumental in helping him navigate the legal maze, and now they were preparing for the next phase. "We need to hear from other victims," Boyd said, sitting across from James in a crowded office stacked with legal files and old coffee cups. "The Attorney General's office is investigating, but they move slow. The media attention is on your side right now. We need to use it." James nodded, already knowing what Boyd was going to say next. "We go public," Boyd continued. "We hold a press conference. We get homeowners who lost everything to tell their stories. We make sure First Union knows this won't just fade away." James exhaled, running a hand through his hair. He had spent months just trying to survive this fight, and now it was turning into something even bigger. But the truth was, he couldn't walk away. "I'm in," he said firmly. "Let's do it." The bank had tried to ruin him. They had taken everything from him, his home, his security, even his freedom for a short time. But now they were the ones on the defensive. And James was going to make sure they finally answered for what they had done. James Carter sat alone in his kitchen, the glow of the single overhead bulb casting deep shadows on the worn wooden table. In front of him was a thick manila envelope, its flap sealed, its weight heavier than it should have been. Inside was more money than he had ever seen in his life, a settlement offer from First Union Bank. He didn't need to open it. He already knew what was inside. Enough cash to clear his debts. Enough to buy a new home, maybe even move somewhere far away where no one knew his name. Enough to make all of this go away. But at what cost? James's hands curled into fists. He had fought too long and too hard to be bought now. This wasn't just about his house anymore. It was about every homeowner who had been steamrolled by a corrupt system, every family who had lost everything without even knowing they had the right to fight back. His phone buzzed beside him, and he glanced at the screen. It was Rebecca Martinez, the former First Union employee who had leaked the bank's internal emails, risking everything to expose their fraud. James picked up. "Tell me you got the same offer." Rebecca sighed on the other end. "Oh yeah. And the conditions are exactly what we expected." He already knew what she meant. A gag order. "Yep," she confirmed. "They're trying to shut us up. If we sign, we can't speak to the media, we can't testify, and we definitely can't participate in the investigation." James closed his eyes, forcing himself to breathe. "They think they can buy their way out of this." "They always do," she muttered. "Most people take the money, and I don't blame them. They just want to move on." James understood that. He really did. He had spent months just trying to survive, sleeping in his car, scraping together money for food, wondering if he would ever get his home back. And now, with the stroke of a pen, he could make all of that disappear. But that's what they were counting on. James stood, pacing the small kitchen. "If we take it, the case dies." Rebecca was quiet for a long moment. "Yeah." James took a deep breath. "I can't do it." A small, relieved laugh came through the phone. "Me neither." James ran a hand through his hair. "So, what do we do next?" Rebecca's voice hardened. "We fight harder." The next morning, James walked into the Justice Collective's office, where Terrence Boyd and his team had already started gathering other homeowners who had been victims of First Union Bank's fraudulent practices. Boyd greeted him with a knowing look. "I take it you didn't take the deal?" James dropped the envelope onto the table. "Not a chance." Boyd smiled. "Good. Because the fight's just getting started." Over the next few days, the pressure on the bank escalated. The leaked emails had been bad enough, But once news of the bank's attempt to silence James and Rebecca got out, it exploded. The media pounced, painting First Union Bank as a corporate giant trying to pay its way out of accountability. James sat down for an interview with a local news station, his hand steady, his voice unwavering. "The bank isn't offering a settlement because they feel bad," he said into the camera. "They're offering it because they're afraid. They know they did something wrong, and they want to bury it before more people find out." The clip went viral. Other homeowners started coming forward. A woman in Ohio who had lost her home after the bank claimed she had missed payments, even though she had proof that she had paid in full. A retired veteran in Texas who had been evicted after First Union found a second mortgage that he had never signed. A single mother in Florida who had been locked out of her home even though her foreclosure case was still in court. One by one, their voices joined James's. And then the real bombshell hit. The state attorney general announced that they were expanding their investigation beyond First Union Bank. The evidence from James's case had led them to other banks using the same fraudulent foreclosure tactics. James sat in Boyd's office, watching the press conference live. The attorney general stood at a podium, surrounded by files and documents, speaking with clear determination. "What we have uncovered is not just one bad bank. It's a pattern of fraud designed to strip homeowners of their rights. This is about more than one case. This is about systemic abuse." James felt his pulse pounding. He had started this fight alone, desperate to keep his mother's home. Now, it had turned into something bigger than he had ever imagined. Later that evening, as James walked back into his house, the house he had nearly lost, his phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. He answered cautiously. "Carter." There was a pause, and then a voice he recognized immediately. Bryce Lambert, the bank's lead attorney. The man who had tried to have him arrested, who had tried to buy him off. "Mr. Carter," Lambert said, his voice clipped. "I'm calling to give you one last chance to reconsider our offer." James didn't even hesitate. "No." Lambert exhaled sharply. "You really think you're going to win this? You think the system is going to change just because you kicked up some dust?" James's grip on the phone tightened. "It's already changing. And you know it." There was silence on the other end. Then Lambert's voice dropped to a near whisper. "You have no idea what you're getting yourself into." James smiled, because for the first time, he wasn't afraid. "No," he said. "But you do." And with that, he hung up. He wasn't going anywhere. And neither was the fight. James Carter sat in his living room, the same room he had fought so hard to keep, watching as the news played on his old television. The reporter's voice carried a weight of urgency, the kind usually reserved for political scandals or major disasters. But this was different. This was about him, or rather, about the fight he had started. Following the landmark ruling in James Carter's foreclosure case, dozens of homeowners have come forward with similar stories of fraudulent practices by banks across the country. Advocacy groups are now calling for stronger regulations, and state officials have confirmed an expanded investigation into wrongful foreclosures. James leaned back against the couch, exhaling slowly. He had always hoped that his fight wouldn't be in vain, that it would mean something beyond just his own victory. Now, he was watching the impact unfold in real time. His phone buzzed on the coffee table. Another email. Another homeowner reaching out. Ever since his case had made national news, his inbox had been flooded with messages, stories of families who had been thrown out of their homes, of seniors who had spent decades paying off their mortgages only to be told they somehow owed more. He clicked on one. "Mr. Carter, I saw you on the news. My parents lost their home last year to First Union Bank. They were told they had missed payments, but my mother kept every receipt. The bank wouldn't listen, and we didn't know what to do. Is there any way you can help?" James swallowed hard. He wanted to help them all, but he was just one man. One man who had barely survived his own battle. But he wasn't alone anymore. Later that evening, he met with Terrence Boyd at the Justice Collective's small office. Papers and case files were scattered across the table. Several volunteers were on phones, answering calls from homeowners desperate for help. "We're getting more reports every day," Boyd said, rubbing his temples. "People who had no idea they were being scammed until your case put a spotlight on it." James nodded. The banks were counting on people not knowing their rights. That's how they got away with it for so long. A young woman sitting at a desk nearby turned toward them. "You should see this," she said, clicking on her laptop. James and Boyd moved to stand behind her as she pulled up a video, one that had already gone viral. It was a recording of an elderly couple standing in front of a small, rundown home. The woman, her silver hair pulled back in a tight bun, spoke directly into the camera. "We spent 40 years in this house. Paid off every dime. And then the bank told us we owed money on a second mortgage we never took out. They took our home. We had nowhere to go." The husband, standing silently beside her, suddenly broke down in tears. James felt something tighten in his chest. The video cut to a clip of another woman, this one younger, maybe in her 30s, standing in front of what was once her home. The windows were boarded up. The grass overgrown. "I believed them when they said I had no options," she said. "Now I know I was lied to. I'm fighting back, just like James Carter did. And I'm not giving up." James took a deep breath and steeled himself. This wasn't just his fight anymore. It never had been. Boyd crossed his arms. People aren't just waking up to what happened to them. They're pushing back. We're seeing homeowners reopening their cases, filing lawsuits, demanding accountability. James nodded slowly. The banks had tried to silence him. They had offered him money to walk away, thrown legal roadblocks in his path, and even had him arrested. But none of it had worked. Now, people were fighting back. And this time, the banks wouldn't win. James Carter sat on his front porch, the same porch his mother had once stood on, holding a paid-in-full mortgage statement with a sense of quiet pride. The fight to save this house had nearly broken him, but now, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and orange, he knew something had changed, not just for him, but for countless others who had been watching his battle unfold. His story had spread farther than he ever imagined. He had been just one man fighting against a massive, faceless system. One man with no legal training, no financial power, no corporate backing. And yet, he had won, not because of luck, not because the system had suddenly decided to be fair, but because he had learned the most valuable lesson of all. Knowledge is power. The banks had counted on him being uninformed. They had buried him in paperwork, misled him about his rights, and used intimidation tactics to scare him into walking away. That's how they had won against so many others. But James had refused to let them confuse him. He had dug deeper, read through foreclosure laws until his eyes burned, and sought out people who could help him understand what was really happening. And in the end, that knowledge had been the one thing the bank couldn't take from him. Now, his story wasn't just a personal victory. It had become a warning, a lesson, and a call to action for homeowners everywhere. In the weeks following his case, community centers began hosting free legal workshops on homeowners' rights. Lawyers volunteered their time to teach seniors and struggling families how to recognize predatory lending practices. People who had once felt powerless were now walking into banks armed with knowledge. One afternoon, James received an email from an elderly woman in Michigan. She had almost lost her home the same way he had, but after seeing his story, she had demanded to see the original documents on her mortgage. The bank couldn't produce them. With the help of a local legal aid group, she had fought back and won. That was the real victory. James hadn't just saved his own home, he had helped others realize they could fight for theirs too. But the fight wasn't over. One evening, he met with Terrence Boyd at the Justice Collective's office, the room now filled with case files from homeowners across the country. Some had already lost their homes and were trying to get justice. Others were facing foreclosure and needed urgent help. "We've got a chance to make real change here," Boyd said, setting down a thick folder labeled State Foreclosure Reform Proposal. "If we push hard enough, we can get legislation passed that forces banks to prove they have the right to foreclose before they take someone's home." James ran his fingers over the folder's cover. Laws could change. The system could become harder to manipulate, harder to exploit. But only if people refused to back down. He took a deep breath and met Boyd's gaze. "Let's do it." This fight had started as something personal. But now, it was about something bigger than one house, bigger than one case. It was about making sure no one else had to go through what he did. Because the only way to stop corruption was to stand up and fight back. James Carter's story teaches us an important truth: knowledge is power, and perseverance is key. Too often, people are led to believe that they have no choice, no voice, and no way to fight back against powerful institutions. But James's journey proves that understanding your rights, standing firm in the face of intimidation, and refusing to be silenced can change everything. Life has a way of throwing challenges at us, some expected, some completely unfair. Whether it's dealing with financial institutions, healthcare decisions, or even personal struggles, the lesson remains the same: never assume the system is working in your favor. Take the time to learn, to ask questions, and to seek help when needed. Courage isn't just about standing up when it's easy, it's about standing tall when everything seems stacked against you. Even when the odds are against you, even when those in power try to shut you down, the simple act of saying, "I won't back down," can make all the difference. You don't have to be young, rich, or well-connected to fight for what's right. You just need determination, knowledge, and the belief that your voice matters. Because it does.